Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of Spring of Code. And today we have Leonard with us from Open Policy Agent. So OPA is a CNCF graduated project. And first of all, we'll talk more about that. And I just want to say thanks a lot, Leonard, for joining. Would you like to tell us a bit more about yourself?
Yeah, I'm Leonard Isakers. I'm a maintainer on a spin-off project of the Open Policy Agent, which is Conftest, and I'll talk about that in a bit as well. And besides that, in my day-to-day work, I'm now working on microservice authorization with the Open Policy Agent.
Nice, cool. Well, thanks a lot for joining, Leonard, and really looking forward to today's session. So for those of you who are just joining us, Spring of Code is basically about getting project maintainers from nice open source projects to share about how you students can get started with it and contribute to it. So we'll talk more about like OPA and organization and how you can get started with it. So the agenda is going to be somewhat like this. Leonard, first, would you like to tell us a bit more about OPA and why was OPA created and what is like the use case of OPA?
Yes, so the Open Policy Agent itself was created to solve like a problem in the policy space. So you can imagine that if you want to set up security across your entire infrastructure, you have to deal with like API authorization, you have to configure database access and database security, you have to configure security through for your like messaging views, and you also have to deal with compliance rules. So you have to ensure that certain databases are running on isolated hosts that are isolated from the other network and only accessible through some firewall or whatever. And what Open Policy Agent was created to do is to create like a unified language for expressing those types of security policies.
Nice. And I see like recently it became graduated in CNCF, right? In February, yeah. I believe. Yeah. So congratulations for that. Nice. All right. Cool. So do you have do you have like a demo of the project, or can we like maybe navigate the GitHub repository and maybe we can talk a bit more about what the tech stack is being used and like what are the prerequisites, as we have many students watching. So that sound good?
Yeah, we can quickly go through. I can actually show the the playground. That is probably one of the. Let me see if I can actually share. So you should now be able to see my screen.
Yeah, I would have to add that to the stream. Let's give it a few seconds. Did you share your screen? Because I'm not able to see.
I shared it, but I see that
it's not showing it over here.
I see that there's some permission issues.
Yeah, actually, yeah.
It's always
I have to like. Yeah, that happens.
It's always the downside with a Mac. I think it's really good what they're doing with the security. You explicitly have to set permissions for everything, which is from a safety perspective, of course, great, but from a usability perspective, you sometimes run into these types.
Yeah. Maybe you can try, resharing once.
I have to actually quit and rejoin before I'm able to, before Mac allows me to share my screen.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, we can do that. No worries.
I'll quit and come back in a second.
Cool. No worries. Cool. So Leonard will be joining us shortly. There was some issues with the screen sharing, but feel free to send your questions in the chat, and we'll be answering those in a few minutes. Cool, let's try again.
Yep. Can you see
Perfect. Yep,
yeah.
Works now.
So I'm first of all going to show like a simple example. This is the Rego Playground. Rego is the language the open policy agent uses to express those security policies I was talking about. So in the Rego Playground, you can easily play around with some of these policies and play around with the language and see what the result is. So in this case, it's expressing a simple RBAC, so role-based access control policy. And it's simply stating, so the main query you as a user would make is check, is a user allowed? So in this case, the default allow is false. You don't want anybody to have access by default. And in this case, the policy checks whether a user is admin, and if a user is admin, they are allowed. And then user is admin is another rule stated here. So in this case, it's simply going through a list of users and checking whether the inputted user has the role admin. So you can then evaluate the policy in the playground with this input. So in this case, we're checking user Alice. And if you look here, Alice is indeed an admin. So allow is true because we check whether Alice is an admin. But if we then check for Bob, for example, oh, I should not select admin. Surprisingly also true. That is actually surprising. Did I change it correctly? Because Bob is not a... Well, maybe this is an example that doesn't work as expected, but that should normally show that because Bob isn't an admin, this rule shouldn't be true, so this shouldn't be true. So I'm not sure what actually shows allow it's true.
A few people are asking, could you maybe zoom in a little bit?
Yeah.
Cool.
But that is like the demo effect. Obviously, whenever you demo something, it will go wrong. But to go a bit into the language itself, the language is a declarative language. So instead of an imperative language where you say, go through this list of user roles. So for each user role, check the user and check whether their role is admin. In this case, you define things, so you declare what you want to check. So in this case, and in Rego, most policies are existentially quantified. So that means that if there exists a user role, so in the user roles object, if there exists the input user, and if there exists a role in their role array that matches admin, then this rule will be true, and otherwise it will be undefined. And if this rule is true, then this user is admin is true, so allow will be true.
Cool. Yeah, that's pretty interesting, and we're getting like a few questions here. But before we dive into like one question that we have gotten is, so we're talking about like what is OPA, right? But someone also asked like, could you maybe also explain how it works? If you can, in brief, like in a more internal level.
Yeah, so internally, OPA is essentially, you can compare it to a SQL database. And in a lot of ways, it is comparable to a database. So internally, oppa takes that Rego language, takes those policies, and combines the rules you write in those policies with the data you store in OPA. So you can imagine storing like users and roles and any kinds of information that might be relevant to a security decision within OPA. And OPA takes the query you as a user make. So I can query for, is this user allowed? And then it internally constructs a query and does a lot of optimizations and goes through all that nested data to answer that query for you. So in a lot of ways, it is really comparable to how a database works.
I see. So like it's a layer in the middle, right? We have our services, then we sending the queries, let's say in JSON format or something, and then there's OPA, and then there's like your database. Is that correct?
No. It is itself a database. So you store
it is itself a database.
Yeah. So you store data in OPA.
Okay. Cool.
Needed to answer certain authorization or security decisions, and then you query OPA, and OPA combines whatever is defined in the policy with whatever data is stored in OPA to come up with an answer to those security questions.
Cool. Great. Thanks a lot for sharing, Leonard. And we have a question here from someone who is, let's say, just joining. Could you maybe also brief about what kind of policies we're talking about here?
Yeah. So there's a couple of types of. It's essentially limitless, and I'll share an interesting example of that later on. But the most common use cases you see are one, microservice authorization. So you can imagine having like 50 microservices and implementing security in each of them individually is quite a bit of work. So what you often see is like a service mesh model where you put a proxy in front of each of those microservices, and that proxy delegates authorization to OPA. So a request comes in, the request is first checked with OPA. Is this request allowed or not? And it can be based on some headers, like the authorization header, for example, that can be based on the IP address. So maybe you want to block certain IP addresses and or whatever is available within the HTTP request. And then if the policy says this request is allowed or denied, then the proxy decides, okay, we can forward this request, or we tell the user that this request is blocked.
So we're talking about like, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and another really popular example is Kubernetes configuration validation. So you can imagine if you're running a lot of cloud infrastructure, if you're running Kubernetes, for example, that you want each of your infrastructure components, you want them to adhere to certain security standards. So you can write OPA policies that state, hey, you can't deploy this application if it doesn't, turn off like a root, like doesn't, if it uses like a root permissions, or you can't deploy this application if it doesn't set up some network policies.
I see. And we're talking about, like you mentioned, the policies is stored in like in the memory of OPA itself, right? So yeah. How do we manage that? Like, what if you wanna, like, is there a call I'm gonna make to over there or somewhere, like maybe some API calls or something? Do you have a structure for that?
So you mean you're talking about storing data in OPA, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can load it into OPA, like you just put it into a file system alongside OPA, and then when starting up OPA, you tell, hey, here on this file system you can find that data. You can indeed send them via the API. So Open Policy Agent has an API for interacting with it, and that has APIs for sending data, for querying OPA, for getting some details about whatever decisions were made. And OPA supports what is called the bundle API. So OPA can actually also fetch data from a remote location. So you can imagine that you want to centrally store your microservice authorization policies in a single place, and then OPA will pull that single bundle API for its data and policy bundles.
I see. And I see a question over here, which is more related to contributions. Can we use other languages rather than Reno to contribute? So let's talk about that in detail. What are the prerequisites if we're talking about from a contribution point of view? So how would one get started with contributing to OPA?
Yeah, so OPA is written in Golang. And everything happens on GitHub. So there's GitHub issues. I think if you want to start contributing to OPA, like the first thing, and it was actually, that's a funny story. 2 years ago, I was at KubeCon, and I was talking with the creator of the open policy agent, Torin Sandon, and I asked him the exact question, like, how do I get involved? Because back then I wasn't involved at all, and I was like, okay, this is a really cool project, so how do I get involved? And the first thing he said, and I think that rings true for like almost any open source project, is just get started with it. Just try out use cases. Try to build an example where you do microservice authorization with OPA, and because that gives you some familiarity with how the project works. And then once you understand how the project works, you can dive into actually contributing to the project. Because you might, like, for example, back then, for me, I started, I was working on infrastructure a lot. So I was working on cloud infrastructure. I was working on setting up Kubernetes. And one of the problems I was facing was, okay, I have a lot of teams deploying cloud infrastructure. How do I ensure that they adhere to a certain security standard? So then I found like a spin-off project of the open policy agent focused on indeed checking that configuration, checking that cloud infrastructure, which is called Conftest. And indeed, I started to just write some rules like, hey, you cannot deploy some file storage if you don't put in some additional security constraints. You cannot deploy your server if you open up port 22 without any additional firewall rules. And then while I started using it, because that spin-off project back then was like really new, it had like 100 stars on GitHub. So I faced some problems. It was like, oh, hey, this didn't work as expected, and it would have been nice if this feature was there, but that wasn't there. And then like I started submitting issues to the project, like, hey, I was doing this and that went wrong, or hey, it would be nice if I could do it in this way. And then from that point, I actually got to the point where Garrett Rushgrove, who created the Conftest, he said like, hey, why don't you contribute by creating your own PR? So then I added things to Conftest, like being able to, I built like a plugin system where you can add arbitrary code to Conftest, which is useful, for example, if you want to run Conftest against the live Kubernetes cluster. I added support for downloading files, so downloading policies from like several remote locations, and like that is how I got involved, by first trying to play with the tools, trying to first find a use case, work on that use case, and then by doing that, you will also notice where the pain points in the project are. But obviously, the other approach, especially for open policy agent itself, because that's like quite an established project, you're not going to run into a situation where things don't. Well, it's unlikely that you run into a situation where things don't work. Obviously, you can also just follow the GitHub issues, and there's like a bi-weekly call, and they have like a roadmap on GitHub, so a roadmap on GitHub to show what they're working on, the biggest issues are at the moment.
Exactly. And yeah, you mentioned a really nice point, which is like actually using the project, before getting started, because if you don't know what it does, then you will find, it very difficult to contribute to it. And we have a question over here from someone. They're mentioning like, how would you compare like OPA with something like Kivarno? What is like the advantages and like the disadvantages of using OPA over it for Kubernetes natively?
That's funny because indeed, like you have Kivarno, which is I think quite a recent CNCF project.
Yeah.
And Kivarno in a lot of ways is quite similar to Gatekeeper. So Gatekeeper is indeed also an open policy agent spin-off that uses open policy agent policies, so Rego policies, to check the security of whatever you deploy to your Kubernetes cluster. And Kivarno essentially does the same thing, but I think where they differ is that Kivarno doesn't use the open policy agent, so it's just as far as I understand Kivarno, because I'm not really familiar with the project, I have to be honest there, is that it has some built-in rules, and that's what you this is what you see more often as well. So it has some built-in rules, so it's easier to get started with. But because it doesn't use its own, like it doesn't support its own policy language, that also means that when you want to customize those checks, that it becomes a lot more difficult. One of the strengths of the open policy agent is that it gives you complete freedom in specifying those security policies. So you can imagine, for example, that maybe in my specific setup, I'm using some specific annotations. And like, let's say I have an annotation on my Kubernetes deployment that states, this is a really highly secure, application. And then whenever that annotation is there, I can write a policy. If that annotation is there, then it needs to adhere to this additional list of security constraints that's not checked against the default set of applications. And that level of customization is harder to achieve with Kivarno versus Gatekeeper. On the other hand, and that's, I think, still one of the biggest problems with both Conftest and Gatekeeper, is that Kivarno comes with like a set of default security policies, which makes the user experience quite nice. Like you just deploy it, some checks. Whereas with both Conftest and Gatekeeper, you first have to write some of those policies, or find them on GitHub. But there isn't like a shared policy registry at the moment.
Maybe we can like also using Helmcharts, for example. Wouldn't that solve like make it a bit easier?
I mean, true. If you build a Helm chart and add like all security defaults in there, that partly solves the problem. But then you always run into a situation where a team will deploy like, hey, we're deploying a database, and the database doesn't use your Helm chart. So now you're dependent on like a downstream Helm chart, like an upstream Helm chart for the security, and they might not have the same security requirements as you have. So Helm can help in the sense that you can craft Helm charts for the teams to use, but that doesn't cover all bases.
That makes sense.
Eventually, you also run into the situation where teams want to do things slightly differently than what is in your Helm chart. We actually, interesting question, because we actually, where I'm working at the moment, we had that same setup indeed, where we had like a set of Helm charts that were like, these are the defaults. But then eventually teams start doing other things, and eventually you have like teams using to just base Kubernetes, teams using customized, teams using Helm charts. It's really hard to force everybody to do the same thing, because then you're limiting them in what they can do. And what the good thing is about Gatekeeper and Kivarno is that you give the teams the freedom to do what they want, but you still implement those security checks before they deploy.
Yeah. And we're talking about like the implementation of OPA. So we're talking about K8s, and there's a question over here: is Kubernetes one of the prerequisites to start with OPA? So maybe we can answer this in a way like we can mention something like, in what other ways can we apply OPA? In like what are the tech stacks?
That's a good question. No, Kubernetes is just a really popular use case of the open policy agent. But for example, and that's an interesting use case. I've actually used it before, and like working in the healthcare space as like a claims fraud detection engine. So like claims, so healthcare claims, submitting an insurance claim, just needs to adhere to certain medical rules. Like for example, you can't claim a certain medicine if the diagnosis doesn't match that medicine. And like even for that use case, because that's essentially just a set of rules, the open policy agent works surprisingly well. So the open policy agent itself is not tied into a certain ecosystem. It's just like a standalone server that you can use for numerous policy-related questions. And it just happens that microservice authorization and Kubernetes are both the most popular use cases, but that doesn't mean that you're limited to those use cases.
Yeah, that was a good question, by the way. And let's now move on to like the contribution part. There are a few questions like, what would you suggest to a beginner who wants to get started with contributing? Like, let's say they have just opened the GitHub repository, they have started using it, and where do they then start with the maybe we can start by sharing the GitHub page, if that's okay. Just navigate. Yeah, of the OPA, navigating the GitHub repo, just like sharing some resources as well, and how students can get started with making some contributions. By the way, this is a good question, like a bit of a funny question, but can beginners contribute?
Yeah, certainly. Like that's always the thing. Like even if you don't die, like because I'll be honest, like open policy agent internally can be quite complicated. It has its own like language compilation. Its own, what is it? Internally, it's a database. So there's like a lot of complicated parts, but that doesn't mean that you can't contribute. For example, and I'll show that. So for example, the language itself has like all kinds of built-in functions. So an example built-in function is like making an HTTP request. So that like should be relatively simple to contribute to like extend the language with some additional built-in functions. Or a good thing that is like always, people will always be happy if you contribute to the documentation, because documentation is always something that will be outdated and will be the better the documentation, the more likely it is that people will use the project and will actually contribute back to it.
Yeah, one thing that a project cannot get enough of is good documentation.
Yeah,
docs. That's true. That's true. All right. So yeah, maybe we can just maybe you can share your screen of the GitHub repo, and we can answer any pending questions we may have. Cool. And I believe it's visible now. Yeah.
I'm first going to start here because the open policy agent group on GitHub has like a couple of projects under it. So you obviously have the main project.
Yeah, could you zoom in a little bit?
Yep.
Thanks.
You obviously have the main project, which is like OPA, this is the open policy agent itself. You have gatekeeper, as mentioned. So this is the admission control webhook controller for Kubernetes that allows you to check open policy agent policies against Kubernetes deployments. You have conf-test, which is the project I'm a maintainer on, which is writing security checks against infrastructure, mostly infrastructure configuration in your CI/CD pipeline. And then there's like a couple of related or smaller projects, like you have an Envoy plugin. So Envoy is like a proxy, and this is like an OPA authorization plugin for Envoy. Contrib is just a list of like cool use cases for the open policy agent, so like a Spring Boot integration and stuff like that. And of course, things like there's a VS Code extension for checking your open policy agent policies. But let's go through some of the projects. I'm actually going to start with Conftest because that's the one I'm most familiar with. So Conftest is a CLI that allows you to write checks against, well, in this case, just files. So you can imagine that before a team deploys like any Terraform or Kubernetes or Ansible or whatever, that you want to ensure they're continuously checking certain security constraints, that the code in their repository doesn't, is continuously validated for these security constraints. It's what we call shifting security left. So ensuring that you check security as early as possible. So Conftest is a CLI. And it's mostly built on, Cobra and Viper, for those who know those libraries. So if you ever built a CLI in Golang, I can definitely recommend getting into Cobra and Viper. They are like the most full-fledged frameworks out there for Cobra for building the CLI and Viper for fetching configuration. So Viper binds with environment variables and flags and ensures that you have like a consistent interface for fetching that configuration from the environment. So, and then there's like a couple of commands that, read a file and then evaluate a policy against that file. And that's actually quite interesting to show. One of the, so you can run the open policy agent as a server, as a standalone server, but one of the ways what makes the open policy agent really powerful is that you can directly load it into an application and use it as a library. So as you, like one of the things we did in Conftest was we load in the open policy agent and use its internal libraries to get policy evaluation not as a standalone server, but as a command line tool. So yeah, I think I'll keep it at that for Conftest. Oh no, one more thing. Because the open policy agent only supports JSON as an input, one thing we did in Conftest is support a bunch of other parsers. So for example, we translate a Docker file into JSON so that the open policy agent understands Docker files. And in that way, we can do some security checks on a Docker file. So you can imagine, for example, hey, I don't want users creating Docker files that set some pseudo permissions and make that available for their application or whatever.
That's pretty interesting, yeah. Yeah.
Then I'll move on to the other side project, which is Gatekeeper. Gatekeeper is like an admission webhook. So if you want to contribute to Gatekeeper, I think the best thing to do is first also understand the Kubernetes ecosystem, because Gatekeeper really integrates into the Kubernetes ecosystem. So in Kubernetes, before you deploy an application, it will go through a bunch of webhooks. It will go through an admission webhook and a mutation webhook. And in this case, gatekeeper is an admission webhook that looks at the incoming request, and that request contains your Kubernetes deployment, or it contains a Kubernetes ingress object, or a Kubernetes service, whatever, and validates that against a set of Rego policies. So contributing to gatekeeper probably requires also an understanding of how like the Kubernetes ecosystem works. As you can see, for example, here it implements it implements some custom resources in your Kubernetes cluster. So it adds. Let's show an example. So it adds the constraint templates, and as you can see, constraint templates uses the open policy agent language to implement a check on some input data. But if you're not familiar with what is it with Kubernetes ecosystem, then this is probably a harder project to contribute to. And let's now move to oppa. It's the last project. So oppa has a couple of components. Well, first of all, like one important note about oppa itself, it doesn't use a lot of external dependencies. It doesn't use a lot of external libraries. To give an example, there is support to fetch data from an S3 bucket. So to fetch OPA policies and the required data for making security decisions from S3. But instead of using an external dependency, so using the AWS Go SDK, it's the code for interacting with that API has been built into oppa itself. And I think this is a really good decision that the creators have made for being like really strict on external dependencies, because that prevents a lot of issues with bugs in upstream libraries or security issues in upstream libraries. You can imagine that if you depend on the AWS SDK and there's like a huge security vulnerability in that AWS SDK, then the open policy agent would have like a big problem. So that is important to know if you want to contribute to the open policy agent itself. Like, don't depend on a huge list of external libraries. You have to have a really good reason for including an external library. What else? It's interesting to know there's like a WebAssembly. So there's WebAssembly support for the open policy agent. So we're into WebAssembly. And there's some really interesting use cases for this specifically. So like one is, for example, embedding the open policy agents directly into like a front end, so into like a React application or a Vue application. But the WebAssembly support goes a lot further than just browsers. For example, Postgres has WebAssembly support, so you can embed the open policy agent directly into a Postgres database. And like here, there's a couple of components. You have like the server, which is like it contains the code for spinning up the open policy agent in server mode. Open policy agent has support for like a sort of unit testing framework for those Rego policies. What else is interesting? Top-down is related to there's this tracing mechanism, so you can debug policies better. That's what is stored in the top-down library. The AST, of course, contains the code for parsing the language and constructing an abstract, syntax tree. And command is just like with conftest. This is like the CLI for interacting with. So you can. There's a command for starting up the server. There's a command for running some tests. And I think that is in short the project. Of course, you can always, if you want to start contributing, the best place to start is always if they're
contributing empty. Yeah.
That's also like a note. If you ever want to start your own open source project, think about these things. So like I spoke with the lead of the SIG for contributor experience in Kubernetes last year at KubeCon, and one thing he just mentioned is like, I was asking him, okay, how do I get people to contribute more actively to, in this case, contests? And he was like, okay, other contributing.md, work on documentation. That is very true. Because without good documentation, people won't use your project, and if they're not using your project, they won't contribute to it.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. Like a few projects like that I got a chance to contribute. Did not have like that much good documentation. Well, the first thing is if you're contributing to a project and it does not have good documentation, then write good documentation. There's always room for improvement. There's always room for improvement, and many people will be happy that you wrote some nice documentations for the project, and also helps the community. But anyway, thanks a lot for sharing, Leonard, and there was some really nice insights. I didn't know about, let's say, the external libraries thing that you mentioned. I believe that's pretty reasonable. And let's see if you have any questions over here specific to it. I'm not sure I see any, but again, just to sum up, and thanks a lot for sharing, everyone. I believe you can see the comments on the screen. Cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just want to share like what I would suggest is like a learn while contributing approach. So many people are like, let me first learn all these things and then I'll contribute. So that's okay, but if you know Golang, if you know a bit about microservices and stuff, there's always good first issues are for these things, right? There's like in projects there are good first issues. So go to the issues tab, and then there's a tag called good first issue, or like beginner friendly issues, easy issues, something like that. So yeah, there's a bunch of places you can get started with it. If you write a blog for OPA, let's say you're just using it, right? Just trying it out and just write a blog for it. That also counts as a valid contribution, right? You can maybe share it with your friends or share it on like your other social platforms, contribute to documentation, for example, for starters. Get started with beginner friendly issues. One thing that I really like is testing. So when I'm contributing to a new project, writing tests for that project is a good place to start, and also looking at the test cases to understand how the entire project is working. That's also a good place to start, because you don't have to know in detail explanation of each and everything in the project. You can just get started with it. But yeah, thanks a lot for sharing. Thanks everyone for giving a shout out in the chat, and thanks Leonard for joining. It was great. Anything else you would like to share?
No, I think you made some good points at the end. I think I learned Golang by contributing to Conftest, because I was like, I think I just had read like the basic Go tutorials when I started contributing. And through contributing, I learned a lot more about the language. Just looking at the codes, looking at what patterns people use, you can learn a lot from being involved with an open source project. And as you mentioned, I think blogging is indeed like something quite underrated. For like contributing to a project, because especially when a project is still new, I blogged a lot about Conftest in the beginning, and that gave people also like an entry point into, hey, what are actual use cases of this project?
Exactly. And since a lot more students are watching, I want to share like CNCF also takes part in like mentorship programs, I believe, like the Linux Foundation programs, Google Summer of Code, for example. So you can check out those as well. There are some awesome projects for you to really contribute over there. But yeah, just to sum up, get started, get involved in the community. They're like, if you're starting with such a project, you will obviously have doubts, right? So you can get those resolved over like in the mailing list or like in the, public chat or something. Like you can join the OPS Slack if you want. You can ask your questions over there in the public channel. There, I believe, maintainer meetings as well, right? Everything is given on the README file. Just go have a look at it. But yeah, thanks a lot everyone for sharing, and thanks a lot Leonard for joining. It was really amazing having you over here, and looking forward to students to make some nice open source contributions in some nice projects. Cool. All right. Well,
it was fun being part of it. Thanks for inviting me.
Most definitely. Well, thanks a lot everyone for joining, and we'll see you all in the next session. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.